Section 15. Work for the out-of-works, the factory. The foregoing, it will be said, is all very well for your outcast when he has got fourpence in his pocket. But what if he has not got his fourpence? What if you are confronted with a crowd of hungry, desperate wretches without even a penny in their pouch, demanding food and shelter? This objection is natural enough, and has been duly considered from the first. I propose to establish in connection with every food and shelter depot a workshop or labor yard in which any person who comes destitute and starving will be supplied with sufficient work to enable him to earn the fourpence needed for his bed and board. This is a fundamental feature of the scheme, and one which I think will commend it to all those who are anxious to benefit the poor by enabling them to help themselves without the demoralizing intervention of charitable relief. Let us take our stand for a moment at the door of one of our shelters. There comes along a grimy, ragged, footsore tramp, his feet bursting out from the sides of his shoes, his clothes all rags, with filthy shirt and tousled hair. He has been, he tells you, on the tramp for the last 3 weeks, seeking work and finding none, slept last night on the embankment, and wants to know if you can give him a bite and a sup, and shelter for the night. Has he any money? Not he. He probably spent the last penny he begged or earned in a pipe of tobacco with which to dull the cravings of his hungry stomach. What are you to do with this man? Remember, this is no fancy sketch. It is a typical case. There are hundreds and thousands of such applicants. Anyone who is at all familiar with life in London and our other large towns will recognize that gaunt figure standing there asking for bread and shelter, or for work by which he can obtain both. What can we do with him? Before him, society stands paralyzed, quieting its conscience every now and then by an occasional dole of bread and soup, varied with the semi-criminal treatment of the casual ward, until the manhood is crushed out of the man, and you have in your hands a reckless, despairing, spirit-broken creature, with not even an aspiration to rise above his miserable circumstances, covered with vermin and filth, sinking ever lower and lower, until at last he is hurried out of sight in the rough shell which carries him to a pauper's grave. I propose to take that man, put a strong arm around him, and extricate him from the mire in which he is all but suffocated. As a first step, we will say to him, "You are hungry. Here is food. You are homeless. Here is a shelter for your head. But remember, you must work for your rations. This is not charity. It is work for the workless, help for those who cannot help themselves. There is the labor shed. Go and earn your fourpence, and then come in out of the cold and wet into the warm shelter. Here is your mug of coffee and your great chunk of bread, and after you have finished these, there is a meeting going on in full swing with its joyful music and hearty human intercourse. There are those who pray for you and with you, and will make you feel yourself a brother among men. There is your shakedown on the floor, where you will have your warm, quiet bed, undisturbed by the ribaldry and curses with which you have been familiar too long. There is the wash-house, where you can have a thorough wash-up at last, after all these days of unwashedness. There is plenty of soap and warm water and clean towels. There, too, you can wash your shirt and have it dried while you sleep. In the morning, when you get up, there will be breakfast for you, and your shirt will be dry and clean. Then, when you are washed and rested, and are no longer faint with hunger, you can go and seek a job, or go back to the labor shop until something better turns up. But where and how? Now let me introduce you to our labor yard. Here is no pretense of charity beyond the charity which gives a man remunerative labor. It is not our business to pay men wages. What we propose is to enable those, male or female, who are destitute, to earn their rations and do enough work to pay for their lodging until they are able to go out into the world and earn wages for themselves. There is no compulsion upon anyone to resort to our shelter, but if a penniless man wants food, he must, as a rule, do work sufficient to pay for what he has of that and of other accommodation. I say as a rule, because of course our officers will be allowed to make exceptions in extreme cases, but the rule will be first work, then eat, and that amount of work will be exacted rigorously. It is that which distinguishes this scheme from mere charitable relief. I do not wish to have any hand in establishing a new center of demoralization. I do not want my customers to be pauperized by being treated to anything which they do not earn. To develop self-respect in the man, to make him feel that at last he has got his foot planted on the first rung of the ladder which leads upwards, is vitally important. And this cannot be done unless the bargain between him and me is strictly carried out. So much coffee, so much bread, so much shelter, so much warmth and light from me, but so much labor in return from him. What labor, it is asked? For answer to this question, I would like to take you down to our industrial workshops in Whitechapel. There you will see the scheme in experimental operation. What we are doing there we propose to do everywhere, up to the extent of the necessity, and there is no reason why we should fail elsewhere if we can succeed there. Our industrial factory at Whitechapel was established this spring. We opened it on a very small scale. It was developed until we have nearly 90 men at work. Some of these are skilled workmen who are engaged in carpentry. The particular job they have now in hand is the making of benches for the Salvation Army. Others are engaged in mat making. Some are cobblers, others painters, and so forth. This trial effort has, so far, answered admirably. No one who is taken on comes for a permanency. So long as he is willing to work for his rations, he is supplied with materials and provided with skilled superintendents. The hours of work are 8 per day. Here are the rules and regulations under which the work is carried on at present. The Salvation Army Social Reform Wing. Temporary Headquarters, 36 Upper Thames Street, London, E.C. City Industrial Workshops. Objects. These workshops are open for the relief of the unemployed and destitute, the object being to make it unnecessary for the homeless or workless to be compelled to go to the workhouse or casual ward, food and shelter being provided for them in exchange for work done by them, until they can procure work for themselves, or it can be found for them elsewhere. Plan of operation. All those applying for assistance will be placed in what is termed the first class. They must be willing to do any kind of work allotted to them. While they remain in the first class, they shall be entitled to 3 meals a day and shelter for the night, and will be expected in return to cheerfully perform the work allotted to them. Promotions will be made from this first class to the second class of all those considered eligible by the labor directors. They will, in addition to the food and shelter above mentioned, receive sums of money up to 5 shillings at the end of the week for the purpose of assisting them to provide themselves with tools to get work outside. Regulations. No smoking, drinking, bad language, or conduct calculated to demoralize will be permitted on the factory premises. No one under the influence of drink will be admitted. Anyone refusing to work or guilty of bad conduct will be required to leave the premises. Hours of work: 7 a.m. to 8:30 a.m., 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., 2 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Doors will be closed 5 minutes after 7, 9, and 2 p.m. Food checks will be given to all as they pass out at each mealtime. Meals and shelter provided at 272 Whitechapel Road. Our practical experience shows that we can provide work by which a man can earn his rations. We shall be careful not to sell the goods so manufactured at less than the market prices. In firewood, for instance, we have endeavored to be rather above the average than below it. As stated elsewhere, we are firmly opposed to injuring one class of workmen while helping another. Attempts on somewhat similar lines to those now being described have hitherto excited the liveliest feelings of jealousy on the part of the trade unions and representatives of labor. They rightly consider it unfair that labor partly paid for out of the rates and taxes, or by charitable contributions, should be put upon the market at less than market value, and so compete unjustly with the production of those who have in the first instance to furnish an important quota of the funds by which these criminal or pauper workers are supported. No such jealousy can justly exist in relation to our scheme, seeing that we are endeavoring to raise the standard of labor, and are pledged to a war to the death against sweating in every shape and form. But it will be asked, how do these out-of-works conduct themselves when you get them into the factory? Upon this point I have a very satisfactory report to render. Many, no doubt, are below par, underfed and suffering from ill health, or the consequence of their intemperance. Many also are old men, who have been crowded out of the labor market by their younger generation. But without making too many allowances on these grounds, I may fairly say that these men have shown themselves not only anxious and willing, but able to work. Our factory superintendent reports, of loss or time there has practically been none since the opening, June 29th. Each man during his stay, with hardly an exception, has presented himself punctually at opening time, and worked more or less assiduously the whole of the labor hours. The morals of the men have been good. In not more than 3 instances has there been an overt act of disobedience, insubordination, or mischief. The men, as a whole, are uniformly civil, willing, and satisfied. They are all fairly industrious. Some, and that not a few, are assiduous and energetic. The foremen have had no serious complaints to make or delinquencies to report. On the 15th of August I had a return made of the names and trades and mode of employment of the men at work. Of the 40 in the shops at that moment, 8 were carpenters, 12 laborers, 2 tailors, 2 sailors, 3 clerks, 2 engineers, while among the rest was a shoemaker, 2 grocers, a cooper, a sailmaker, a musician, a painter, and a stonemason. 19 of these were employed in sawing, cutting, and tying up firewood. 6 were making mats, 7 making sacks, and the rest were employed in various odd jobs. Among them was a Russian carpenter, who could not speak a word of English. The whole place is a hive of industry, which fills the hearts of those who go to see it with hope that something is about to be done to solve the difficulty of the unemployed. Although our factories will be permanent institutions, they will not be anything more than temporary resting places to those who avail themselves of their advantages. They are harbors of refuge, into which the storm-tossed workman may run and refit, so that he may again push out to the ordinary sea of labor and earn his living. The establishment of these industrial factories seems to be one of the most obvious duties of those who could effectually deal with the social problem. They are as indispensable a link in the chain of deliverance as the shelters. But they are only a link, and not a stopping place. And we do not propose that they should be regarded as anything but stepping stones to better things. These shops will also be of service for men and women temporarily unemployed who have families, and who possess some sort of home. In numerous instances, if by any means these unfortunates could find bread and rent for a few weeks, they would tide over their difficulties, and an untold amount of misery would be averted. In such cases, work would be supplied at their own homes, where preferred, especially for the women and children, and such remuneration would be aimed at as would supply the immediate necessities of the hour. To those who have rent to pay and families to support, something beyond rations would be indispensable. The labor shops will enable us to work out our anti-sweating experiments. For instance, we propose at once to commence manufacturing matchboxes, for which we shall aim at giving nearly treble the amount at present paid to the poor starving creatures engaged in this work. In all these workshops, our success will depend upon the extent to which we are able to establish and maintain in the minds of the workers sound moral sentiments, and to cultivate a spirit of hopefulness and aspiration. We shall continually seek to impress upon them the fact that while we desire to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and provide shelter for the shelterless, we are still more anxious to bring about that regeneration of heart and life which is essential to their future happiness and well-being. But no compulsion will for a moment be allowed with respect to religion. The man who professes to love and serve God will be helped because of such profession, and the man who does not will be helped in the hope that he will, sooner or later, in gratitude to God, do the same. But there will be no melancholy misery-making for any. There is no sanctimonious long face in the army. We talk freely about salvation, because it is to us the very light and joy of our existence. We are happy, and we wish others to share our joy. We know by our own experience that life is a very different thing when we have found the peace of God, and we are working together with Him for the salvation of the world instead of toiling for the realization of worldly ambition or the amassing of earthly gain. End of Section 15. Section 16. The regimentation of the unemployed. When we have got the homeless, penniless tramp washed, and housed, and fed at the shelter, and have secured him the means of earning his fourpence by chopping firewood, or making mats, or cobbling the shoes of his fellow laborers at the factory, we have next to seriously address ourselves to the problem of how to help him to get back into the regular ranks of industry. The shelter and the factory are but stepping stones which have this advantage. They give us time to look round and to see what there is in a man and what we can make of him. The first and most obvious thing to do is to ascertain whether there is any demand in the regular market for the labor which is thus thrown upon our hands. In order to ascertain this, I have already established a labor bureau, the operations of which I shall at once largely extend, at which employers can register their needs, and workmen can register their names and the kind of work they can do. At present there is no labor exchange in existence in this country. The columns of the daily newspaper are the only substitute for this much-needed register. It is one of the many painful consequences arising from the overgrowth of cities. In a village where everybody knows everybody else, this necessity does not exist. If a farmer wants a couple of extra men for mowing or some more women for binding at harvest time, he runs over in his mind the names of every available person in the parish. Even in a small town there is little difficulty in knowing who wants employment. But in the cities this knowledge is not available. Hence we constantly hear of persons who would be very glad to employ labor for odd jobs in an occasional stress of work, while at the same time hundreds of persons are starving for want of work at another end of the town. To meet this evil, the laws of supply and demand have created the sweating middlemen, who farm out the unfortunates and charge so heavy a commission for their share that the poor wretches who do the work receive hardly enough to keep body and soul together. I propose to change all this by establishing registers which will enable us to lay our hands at a moment's notice upon all the unemployed men in a district in any particular trade. In this way we should become the universal intermediary between those who have no employment and those who want workmen. In this we do not propose to supersede or interfere with the regular trade unions. Where unions exist, we should place ourselves in every case in communication with their officials. But the most helpless mass of misery is to be found among the unorganized laborers who have no union, and who are, therefore, the natural prey of the middleman. Take, for instance, one of the most wretched classes of the community, the poor fellows who perambulate the streets as sandwich men. These are farmed out by certain firms. If you wish to send 50 or 100 men through London carrying boards announcing the excellence of your goods, you go to an advertising firm, who will undertake to supply you with as many sandwich men as you want for 2 shillings or half a crown a day. The men are forthcoming, your goods are advertised, you pay your money. But how much of that goes to the men? About 1 shilling, or 1 shilling and 3 pence. The rest goes to the middleman. I propose to supersede this middleman by forming a cooperative association of sandwich men. At every shelter there would be a sandwich brigade, ready in any numbers when wanted. The cost of registration and organization, which the men would gladly pay, need not, certainly, amount to more than a penny in the shilling. All that is needed is to establish a trustworthy and disinterested center round which the unemployed can group themselves, and which will form the nucleus of a great cooperative self-helping association. The advantages of such a bureau are obvious, but in this also I do not speak from theory. I have behind me the experience of 7 months of labor both in England and Australia. In London we have a registration office in Upper Thames Street, where the unemployed come every morning in droves to register their names and to see whether they can obtain situations. In Australia, I see, it was stated in the House of Assembly that our officers had been instrumental in finding situations for no less than 132 out-of-works in a few days. Here in London we have succeeded in obtaining employment for a great number, although of course it is beyond our power to help all those who apply. We have sent haymakers down to the country, and there is every reason to believe that when our organization is better known and in more extended operation, we shall have a great labor exchange between town and country, so that when there is a scarcity in one place and congestion in another, there will be information immediately sent so that the surplus labor can be drafted into those districts where labor is wanted. For instance, in the harvest seasons, with changeable weather, it is quite a common occurrence for the crops to be seriously damaged for want of laborers, while at the same time there will be thousands wandering about in the big towns and cities, seeking work but finding no one to hire them. Extend the system all over the world, and make it not only applicable to the transfer of workers between the towns and the provinces, but between country and country, and it is impossible to exaggerate the enormous advantages which would result. The officer in charge of our Experimental Labor Bureau sends me the following notes as to what has already been done through the agency of the Upper Thames Street office. Salvation Army Social Reform Wing, Labor Bureau. Bureau opened June 16, 1890. The following are particulars of transactions up to September 26, 1890. Applications for employment. Men, 2,462. Women, 208. Total, 2,670. Applications from employers for men, 128. Women, 59. Total, 187. Sent to work, men, 301. Women, 68. Total, 369. Permanent situations, 146. Temporary employment, boardmen, cleaners, etc., etc., 223. Sent to workshop in Hanbury Street, 165. End of Section 16. Section 17. The Household Salvage Brigade. It is obvious that the moment you begin to find work for the unemployed labor of the community, no matter what you do by way of the registration and bringing together of those who want work and those who want workers, there will still remain a vast residuum of unemployed, and it will be the duty of those who undertake to deal with the question to devise means for securing them employment. Many things are possible when there is a directing intelligence at headquarters and discipline in the rank and file, which would be utterly impossible when everyone is left to go where he pleases, when 10 men are running for one man's job, and when no one can be depended upon to be in the way at the time when he is wanted. When my scheme is carried out, there will be in every populous center a captain of industry, an officer specially charged with the regimentation of unorganized labor, who would be continually on the alert, thinking how best to utilize the waste human material in his district. It is contrary to all previous experience to suppose that the addition of so much trained intelligence will not operate beneficially in securing the disposal of a commodity which is at present a drug in the market. Robertson of Brighton used frequently to remark that every truth was built up of 2 apparent contradictory propositions. In the same way, I may say that the solution of every social difficulty is to be found in the discovery of 2 corresponding difficulties. It is like the puzzle maps of children. When you are putting one together, you suddenly come upon some awkward piece that will not fit in anywhere, but you do not, in disgust and despair, break your piece into fragments or throw it away. On the contrary, you keep it by you, knowing that before long you will discover a number of other pieces which it will be impossible to fit in until you fix your unmanageable, unshapely piece in the center. Now, in the work of piecing together the fragments which lie scattered around the base of our social system, we must not despair because we have in the unorganized, untrained laborers that which seems hopelessly out of fit with everything around. There must be something corresponding to it which is equally useless until he can be brought to bear upon it. In other words, having got one difficulty in the case of the out-of-works, we must cast about to find another difficulty to pair off against it, and then out of 2 difficulties will arise the solution of the problem. We shall not have far to seek before we discover in every town and in every country the corresponding element to our unemployed laborer. We have waste labor on the one hand, We have waste commodities on the other. About waste land I shall speak in the next chapter. I am concerned now solely with waste commodities. Herein we have a means of immediately employing a large number of men, under conditions which will enable us to permanently provide for many of those whose hard lot we are now considering. I propose to establish in every large town what I may call a household salvage brigade, a civil force of organized collectors who will patrol the whole town as regularly as policemen, who will have their appointed beats, and each of whom will be trusted with the task of collecting the waste of the houses in their circuit. In small towns and villages this is already done, and it will be noticed that most of the suggestions which I have put forth in this book are based upon the central principle, which is that of restoring to the overgrown and therefore uninformed masses of population in our towns the same intelligence and cooperation as to the mutual wants of each and all that prevails in your small town or village. The latter is the manageable unit, because its dimensions and its needs have not outgrown the range of the individual intelligence and ability of those who dwell therein. Our troubles in large towns arise chiefly from the fact that the massing of population has caused the physical bulk of society to outgrow its intelligence. It is as if a human being had suddenly developed fresh limbs which were not connected by any nervous system with the gray matter of his brain. Such a thing is impossible in the human being, but unfortunately it is only too possible in human society. In the human body no member can suffer without an instantaneous telegram being dispatched, as it were, to the seat of intelligence. The foot or the finger cries out when it suffers, and the whole body suffers with it. So in a small community everyone, rich and poor, is more or less cognizant of the sufferings of the community. In a large town, where people have ceased to be neighborly, there is only a congested mass of population settled down on a certain small area without any human ties connecting them together. Here it is perfectly possible, and it frequently happens, that men actually die of starvation within a few doors of those who, if they had been informed of the actual condition of the sufferer that lay within earshot of their comfortable drawing-rooms, would have been eager to minister the needed relief. What we have to do, therefore, is to grow a new nervous system for the body politic, to create a swift, almost automatic means of communication between the community as a whole and the meanest of its members, so as to restore to the city what the village possesses. I do not say that the plan which I have suggested is the only plan or the best plan conceivable. All that I claim for it is that it is the only plan which I can conceive as practicable at the present moment, and that, as a matter of fact, it holds the field alone, for no one, so far as I have been able to discover, even proposes to reconstitute the connection between what I have called the gray matter of the brain of the municipal community and all the individual units which make up the body politic. Carrying out the same idea, I come to the problem of the waste commodities of the towns, and we will take this as an earnest of the working out of the general principle. In the villages there is very little waste. The sewage is applied directly to the land, and so becomes a source of wealth instead of being emptied into great subterranean reservoirs to generate poisonous gases, which, by a most ingenious arrangement, are then poured forth into the very heart of our dwellings, as is the case in the great cities. Neither is there any waste of broken victuals. The villager has his pig or his poultry, or if he has not a pig, his neighbor has one, and the collection of broken victuals is conducted as regularly as the delivery of the post. And as it is with broken victuals, so it is with rags and bones and old iron and all the debris of a household. When I was a boy, one of the most familiar figures in the streets of a country town was the man who, with his small hand-barrow or donkey-cart, made a regular patrol through all the streets once a week, collecting rags, bones, and all other waste materials, buying the same from the juveniles who collected them in specie, not of Her Majesty's current coin, but of common sweetmeats known as claggum or taffy. When the tootling of his familiar horn was heard, the children would bring out their stores and trade as best they could with the itinerant merchant, with the result that the closets which in our town today have become the receptacles of all kinds of disused lumber were kept then swept and garnished. Now, what I want to know is why can we not establish on a scale commensurate with our extended needs the rag-and-bone industry in all our great towns? That there is sufficient to pay for the collection is, I think, indisputable. If it paid in a small north country town or midland village, why would it not pay much better in an area where the houses stand more closely together, and where luxurious living and thriftless habits have so increased that there must be proportionately far more breakage, more waste, and therefore more collectible matter than in the rural districts? In looking over the waste of London, it has occurred to me that in the debris of our households there is sufficient food, if utilized, to feed many of the starving poor, and to employ some thousands of them in its collection, and in addition largely to assist the general scheme. What I propose would be to go to work on something like the following plan. London would be divided into districts, beginning with that portion of it most likely to furnish the largest supplies of what would be worth collection. 2 men, or a man and a boy, would be told of for this purpose to the district. Households would be requested to allow a receptacle to be placed in some convenient spot in which the servants could deposit the waste food, and a sack of some description would also be supplied for the paper, rags, etc. The whole would be collected, say, once or twice a week, or more frequently, according to the season and circumstances, and transferred to depots as central as possible to the different districts. At present, much of this waste is thrown into the dustbin, there to fester and breed disease. Then there are old newspapers, ragged books, old bottles, tins, canisters, etc. We all know what a number of articles there are which are not quite bad enough to be thrown into the dust heap, and yet are no good to us. We put them on one side, hoping that something may turn up, and as that something very seldom does turn up, there they remain. Crippled musical instruments, for instance, old toys, broken-down perambulators, old clothes, all the things, in short, for which we have no more need, and for which there is no market within our reach, but which we feel it would be a sin and a shame to destroy. When I get my household salvage brigade properly organized, beginning, as I said, in some district where we should be likely to meet with most material, our uniformed collectors would call every other day or twice a week with their hand-barrow or pony-cart. As these men would be under strict discipline and numbered, the householder would have a security against any abuse of which such regular callers might otherwise be the occasion. At present, the rag-and-bone man who drives a more or less precarious livelihood by intermittent visits is looked upon askance by prudent housewives. They fear, in many cases, he takes the refuse in order to have the opportunity of finding something which may be worth while picking up, and should he be impudent or negligent, there is no authority to whom they can appeal. Under our brigade, each district would have its numbered officer, who would himself be subordinate to a superior officer, to whom any complaints could be made, and whose duty it would be to see that the officers under his command punctually performed their rounds and discharged their duties without offense. Here let me disclaim any intention of interfering with the Little Sisters of the Poor, or any other persons who collect the broken victuals of hotels and other establishments for charitable purposes. My object is not to poach on my neighbors' domains, nor shall I ever be a party to any contentious quarrels for the control of this or that source of supply. All that is already utilized I regard as outside my sphere. The unoccupied wilderness of waste is a wide enough area for the operations of our brigade, but it will be found in practice that there are no competing agencies. While the broken victuals of certain large hotels are regularly collected, the things before enumerated and a number of others are untouched because not sought after. Of the immense extent to which food is wasted, few people have any notion except those who have made actual experiments. Some years ago Lady Wolseley established a system of collection from house to house in Mayfair in order to secure materials for a charitable kitchen, which, in concert with Baroness Burdett Coutts, she had started at Westminster. The amount of the food which she gathered was enormous. Sometimes legs of mutton from which only 1 or 2 slices had been cut were thrown into the tub where they waited for the arrival of the cart on its rounds. It is by no means an excessive estimate to assume that the waste of the kitchens of the West End would provide a sufficient sustenance for all the out-of-works who will be employed in our labor sheds at the industrial centers. All that it needs is collection, prompt, systematic, by disciplined men who can be relied upon to discharge their task with punctuality and civility, and whose failure in this duty can be directly brought to the attention of the controlling authority. Of the utilization of much of the food which is to be so collected, I shall speak hereafter, when I come to describe the second great division of my scheme, namely the farm colony. Much of the food collected in the Household Salvage Brigade would not be available for human consumption. In this the greatest care would be exercised, and the remainder would be dispatched, if possible, by barges down the river to the farm colony, where we shall meet it hereafter. But food is only one of the materials which we should handle. At our Whitechapel factory there is one shoemaker whom we picked off the streets destitute and miserable. He is now saved and happy, and cobbles away at the shoe leather of his mates. That shoemaker, I foresee, is but the pioneer of a whole army of shoemakers, constantly at work in repairing the cast-off boots and shoes of London. Already in some provincial towns a great business is done by the conversion of old shoes into new. They call the men so employed translators. Boots and shoes, as every wearer of them knows, do not go to pieces all at once, or in all parts at once. The sole often wears out utterly, while the upper leather is quite good, or the upper leather bursts, while the sole remains practically in a salvable condition. But your individual pair of shoes and boots are no good to you when any section of them is hopelessly gone to the bad. But give our trained artist in leather and his army of assistants a couple of thousand pairs of boots and shoes, and it will go ill with him if, out of the couple of thousand pairs of wrecks, he cannot construct 500 pairs which, if not quite good, will be immeasurably better than the apologies for boots which covered the feet of many a poor tramp, to say nothing of the thousands of poor children who are at the present moment attending our public schools. In some towns they have already established a boot and shoe fund, in order to provide the little ones who come to school with shoes warranted not to let in water between the schoolhouse and home. When you remember the 43,000 children who are reported by the school board to attend the schools of London alone, unfed and starving, do you not think there are many thousands to whom we could easily dispose with advantage the resurrected shoes of our boot factory? This, however, is only one branch of industry. Take old umbrellas. We all know the itinerant umbrella mender whose appearance in the neighborhood of the farmhouse leads the good wife to look after her poultry and to see well to it that the watchdog is on the premises. But that gentleman is almost the only agency by which old umbrellas can be rescued from the dust heap. Side by side with our boot factory, we shall have a great umbrella works. The ironwork from one umbrella will be fitted to the stick of another, and even from those that are too hopelessly gone for any further use as umbrellas, we shall find plenty of use for their steels and whalebone. So I might go on. Bottles are a fertile source of minor domestic worry. When you buy a bottle, you have to pay a penny for it, but when you have emptied it, you cannot get a penny back. No, not even a farthing. You throw your empty bottle either into the dust heap or let it lie about. But if we could collect all the waste bottles of London every day, it would go hardly with us if we could not turn a very pretty penny by washing them, sorting them, and sending them out on a new lease of life. The washing of old bottles alone will keep a considerable number of people going. I can imagine the objection which will be raised by some short-sighted people, that by giving the old second-hand material a new lease on life, it will be said that we shall diminish the demand for new material, and so curtail work and wages at one end while we are endeavoring to piece on something at the other. This objection reminds me of a remark of a North Country pilot, who, when speaking of the dullness in the shipbuilding industry, said that nothing would do any good but a series of heavy storms, which would send a goodly number of ocean-going steamers to the bottom, to replace which, this political economist thought, the yards would once more be filled with orders. This, however, is not the way in which work is supplied. Economy is a great auxiliary to trade inasmuch as the money saved is expended in other products of industry. There is one material that is continually increasing in quantity, which is the despair of the life of the householder and of the local sanitary authority. I refer to the tins in which provisions are supplied. Nowadays everything comes to us in tins. We have coffee tins, meat tins, salmon tins, and tins ad nauseam. Tin is becoming more and more the universal envelope for the rations of man. But when you have extracted the contents of the tin, what can you do with it? Huge mountains of empty tins lie about every dust yard, for as yet no man has discovered a means of utilizing them in great masses. Their market price is about 4 or 5 shillings a ton, but they are so light that it would take half a dozen trucks to hold a ton. They formerly burnt them for the sake of the solder, but now by a new process they are joined without solder. The problem of the utilization of the tins is one to which we would have to address ourselves, and I am by no means desponding as to the result. I see in the old tins of London at least one means of establishing an industry which is at present almost monopolized by our neighbors. Most of the toys which are sold in France on New Year's Day are almost entirely made of sardine tins collected in the French capital. The toy market of England is at present far from being overstocked, for there are multitudes of children who have no toys worth speaking of with which to amuse themselves. In these empty tins I see a means of employing a large number of people in turning out cheap toys which will add a new joy to the households of the poor to whom every farthing is important, not the rich. The rich can always get toys, but the children of the poor who live in one room and have nothing to look out upon but the slum or the street, these desolate little things need our toys, and if supplied cheap enough, they will take them in sufficient quantities to make it worth while to manufacture them. A whole book might be written concerning the utilization of the waste of London, but I am not going to write one. I hope before long to do something much better than write a book, namely, to establish an organization to utilize the waste, and then, if I describe what is being done, it will be much better than by now explaining what I propose to do. But there is one more waste material to which it is necessary to allude. I refer to old newspapers and magazines and books. Newspapers accumulate in our houses until we sometimes burn them in sheer disgust. Magazines and old books lumber our shelves until we hardly know where to turn to put a new volume. My brigade will relieve the householder from these difficulties, and thereby become a great distributing agency of cheap literature. After the magazine has done its duty in the middle-class household, it can be passed on to the reading rooms, workhouses, and hospitals. Every publication issued from the press that is of the slightest use to men and women will, by our scheme, acquire a double share of usefulness. It will be read first by its owner, and then by many people who would never otherwise see it. We shall establish an immense second-hand bookshop. All the best books that come into our hands will be exposed for sale, not merely at our central depots, but on the barrows of our peripatetic colporteurs, who will go from street to street with literature which, I trust, will be somewhat superior to the ordinary pablum supplied to the poor. After we have sold all we could, and given away all that is needed to public institutions, the remainder will be carried down to our great paper mill, of which we shall speak later, in connection with our farm colony. The Household Salvage Brigade will constitute an agency capable of being utilized to any extent for the distribution of parcels, newspapers, etc. When once you have your reliable man who will call at every house with the regularity of a postman, and go his beat with the punctuality of a policeman, you can do great things with him. I do not need to elaborate this point. It will be a universal corps of commissionaires, created for the service of the public and in the interests of the poor, which will bring us into direct relations with every family in London, and will therefore constitute an unequaled medium for the distribution of advertisements and the collection of information. It does not require a very fertile imagination to see that when such a house-to-house visitation is regularly established, it will develop in all directions, and, working, as it would, in connection with our anti-sweating shops and industrial colony, would probably soon become the medium for negotiating sundry household repairs, from a broken window to a damaged stocking. If a porter were wanted to move furniture, or a woman wanted to do charring, or someone to clean windows, or any other odd job, the ubiquitous servant of all who called for the waste, either verbally or by postcard, would receive the order, and whoever was wanted would appear at the time desired without any further trouble on the part of the householder. One word as to the cost. There are 500,000 houses in the Metropolitan Police District. To supply every house with a tub and a sack for the reception of waste would involve an initial expenditure which could not possibly be less than 1 shilling a house. So huge is London, and so enormous the numbers with which we shall have to deal, that this simple preliminary would require a cost of £25,000. Of course, I do not propose to begin on anything like such a vast scale. That sum, which is only one of the many expenditures involved, will serve to illustrate the extent of the operations which the Household Salvage Brigade will necessitate. The enterprise is, therefore, beyond the reach of any but a great and powerful organization, commanding capital, and able to secure loyalty, discipline, and willing service. End of Section 17. Section 18. To the country, the farm colony. I'll leave on one side for a moment various features of the operations which will be indispensable but subsidiary to the city colony, such as the rescue homes for lost women, the retreats for inebriates, the homes for discharged prisoners, the enquiry office for the discovery of lost friends and relatives, and the advice bureau, which will, in time, become an institution that will be invaluable as a poor man's tribune. All these and other suggestions for saving the lost and helping the poor, although they form essential elements of the city colony, will be better dealt with after I've explained the relation which the farm colony will occupy to the city colony, and set forth the way in which the former will act as a feeder to the colony oversea. I have already described how I propose to deal, in the first case, with the mass of surplus labor which will infallibly accumulate on our hands as soon as the shelters are more extensively established and in good working order. But I fully recognize that when all has been done that can be done in the direction of disposing of the unhired men and women of the town, there will still remain many whom you can neither employ in the Household Salvage Brigade, nor for whom employers, be they registered never so carefully, can be found. What, then, must be done with them? The answer to that question seems to me obvious. They must go upon the land. The land is the source of all food. Only by the application of labor can the land be made fully productive. There is any amount of waste land in the world, not far away in distant continents next door to the North Pole, but here at our very doors. Have you ever calculated, for instance, the square miles of unused land which fringe the sides of all our railroads? No doubt some embankments are of material that would baffle the cultivating skill at a Chinese or the careful husbandry of a Swiss mountaineer. But these are exceptions. When other people talk of reclaiming Salisbury Plain, or of cultivating the bare moorlands of the bleak north, I think of the hundreds of square miles of land that lie in long ribbons on the side of each of our railways, upon which, without any cost for cartage, innumerable tons of city manure could be shot down, and the crops of which could be carried at once to the nearest market without any but the initial cost of heaping into convenient trucks. These railway embankments constitute a vast estate, capable of growing fruit enough to supply all the jam that Cross and Blackwell ever boiled. In almost every county in England are vacant farms, and in still greater numbers farms but a quarter cultivated, which only need the application of an industrious population working with due incentive to produce twice, thrice, and 4 times as much as they yield today. I am aware that there are few subjects upon which there are such fierce controversies as the possibilities of making a livelihood out of small holdings. But Irish courtiers do it, and in regions infinitely worse adapted for the purpose than our Essex cornlands, and possessing none of the advantages which civilization and cooperation place at the command of an intelligently directed body of husbandmen. Talk about the land not being worth cultivating. Go to the Swiss valleys and examine for yourself the miserable patches of land hewed out, as it were, from the heart of the granite mountains, where the cottager grows his crops and makes a livelihood. No doubt he has his Alp, where his cows pasture in summer-time, and his other occupations which enable him to supplement the scanty yield of his farm garden among the crags. But if it pays the Swiss mountaineer in the midst of the eternal snows, far removed from any market, to cultivate such miserable soil in the brief summer of the high Alps, it is impossible to believe that Englishmen, working on English soil, close to our markets and enjoying all the advantages of cooperation, cannot earn their daily bread by their daily toil. The soil of England is not unkindly, and although much is said against our climate, it is, as Mr. Russell Lowell observes after a lengthened experience of many countries and many climes, the best climate in the whole world for the laboring man. There are more days in the English year on which a man can work out of doors with a spade with comparative comfort than in any other country under heaven. I do not say that men will make a fortune out of the land, nor do I pretend that we can, under the gray English skies, hope ever to vie with the productiveness of the Jersey farms. But I am prepared to maintain against all comers that it is possible for an industrious man to grow his rations, provided he is given a spade with which to dig and land to dig in. Especially will this be the case with intelligent direction and the advantages of cooperation. Is it not a reasonable supposition? It always seems to me a strange thing that men should insist that you must first transport your laborer thousands of miles to a desolate, bleak country in order to set him to work to extract a livelihood from the soil, when hundreds of thousands of acres lie only half-tilled at home or not tilled at all. Is it reasonable to think that you can only begin to make a living out of land when it lies several thousand miles from the nearest market, and thousands of miles from the place where the laborer has to buy his tools and procure all the necessaries of life which are not grown on the spot? If a man can make squatting pay on the prairies or in Australia, where every quarter of grain which he produces has to be dragged by locomotives across the railways of the continent, and then carried by steamers across the wide ocean, can he not equally make the operation at least sufficiently profitable to keep himself alive if you plant him with the same soil within an hour by rail of the greatest markets in the world? The answer to this is that you cannot give your man as much soil as he has on the prairies or in the Canadian lumberlands. This, no doubt, is true. But the squatter who settles in the Canadian backwoods does not clear his land all at once. He lives on a small portion of it, and goes on digging and delving little by little, until after many years of Herculean labor, he hews out for himself and his children after him a freehold estate. Freehold estates, I admit, are not to be had for the picking up on English soil. But if a man will but work in England as they work in Canada or in Australia, he will find as little difficulty in making a livelihood here as there. I may be wrong, but when I travel abroad and see the desperate struggle on the part of peasant proprietors and the small holders in mountainous districts for an additional patch of soil, the idea of cultivating which would make our agricultural laborers turn up their nose in speechless contempt, I cannot but think that our English soil could carry a far greater number of souls to the acre than that which it bears at present. Suppose, for instance, that Essex were suddenly to find itself unmoored from its English anchorage and towed across the Channel to Normandy. Or, not to imagine miracles, suppose that an armada of Chinese were to make a descent on the Isle of Thanet, as did the sea kings Hengist and Horsa. Does anyone imagine for a moment that Kent, fertile and cultivated as it is, would not be regarded as a very Garden of Eden out of the odd corners of which our yellow-skinned invaders would contrive to extract sufficient to keep themselves in sturdy health? I only suggest the possibility in order to bring out clearly the fact that the difficulty is not in the soil, nor in the climate, but in the lack of application of sufficient labor to sufficient land in the truly scientific way. What is the scientific way? I shall be asked impatiently. I am not an agriculturist. I do not dogmatize. I have read much from many pens, and have noted the experiences of many colonies, and I have learned the lesson that it is in the school of practical labor that the most valuable knowledge is to be obtained. Nevertheless, the bulk of my proposals are based upon the experience of many who have devoted their lives to the study of the subject and have been endorsed by specialists whose experience gives them authority to speak with unquestioning confidence. The farm proper. My present idea is to take an estate from 500 to 1,000 acres, within reasonable distance of London. It should be of such land as will be suitable for market gardening, while having some clay on it for brick-making, and for crops requiring a heavier soil. If possible, it should not only be on a line of railway which is managed by intelligent and progressive directors, but it should have access to the sea and to the river. It should be freehold land, and it should lie at some considerable distance from any town or village. The reason for the latter desideratum is obvious. We must be near London for the sake of our market and for the transmission of the commodities collected by our household salvage brigade, but it must be some little distance from any town or village in order that the colony may be planted clear out in the open, away from the public house, that upas tree of civilization. A sine qua non of the new farm colony is that no intoxicating liquors will be permitted within its confines on any pretext whatever. The doctors will have to prescribe some other stimulant than alcohol for residents in this colony. But it will be little use excluding alcohol with a strong hand and by cast-iron regulations if the colonists have only to take a short walk in order to find themselves in the midst of the Red Lions and the Blue Dragons and the George the Fourths which abound in every country town. Having obtained the land, I should proceed to prepare it for the colonists. This is an operation which is essentially the same in any country. You need water supply, provisions, and shelter. All this would be done at first in the simplest possible style. Our pioneer brigade, carefully selected from the competent out-of-works in the city colony, would be sent down to lay out the estate and prepare it for those who would come after. And here let me say that it is a great delusion to imagine that in the riffraff and the waste of the labor market there are no workmen to be had except those that are worthless. Worthless under the present conditions, exposed to constant temptations to intemperance, no doubt they are. But some of the brightest men in London, with some of the smartest pairs of hands and the cleverest brains, are at the present moment weltering helplessly in the sludge from which we propose to rescue them. I am not speaking without book in this matter. Some of my best officers today have been even such as they. There is an infinite potentiality of capacity lying latent in our provincial tap rooms and the city gin palaces, if you can but get them soundly saved, and even short of that, if you can place them in conditions where they would no longer be liable to be sucked back into their old disastrous habits, you may do great things with them. I can well imagine the incredulous laughter which will greet my proposal. What, it will be said, do you think that you can create agricultural pioneers out of the scum of cockneydom? Let us look for a moment at the ingredients which make up what you call the scum of cockneydom. After careful examination and close cross-questioning of the out-of-works, whom we have already registered at our Labor Bureau, we find that at least 60% are country folk, men, women, boys, and girls, who have left their homes in the countries to come up to town in the hope of bettering themselves. They are in no sense of the word cockneys, and they represent not the dregs of the country, but rather its brighter and more adventurous spirits who have boldly tried to make their way in new and uncongenial spheres, and have terribly come to grief. Of 30 cases selected haphazard in the various shelters during the week ending July 5, 1890, 22 were country-born, 16 were men who had come up a long time ago, but did not ever seem to have settled to regular employ, and 4 were old military men. Of 60 cases examined into the Bureau and shelters during the fortnight ending August 2nd, 42 were country people, 26 men who had been in London for various periods, ranging from 6 months to 4 years. 9 were lads under 18, who had run away from home and come up to town, while 4 were ex-military. Of 85 cases of dossers who were spoken to at night when they slept in the streets, 63 were country people. A very small proportion of the genuine homeless out-of-works are Londoners bred and born. There is another element in the matter, the existence of which will be news to most people, and that is the large proportion of ex-military men who are among the helpless, hopeless, destitute. Mr. Arnold White, after spending many months in the streets of London, interrogating more than 4,000 men whom he found in the course of one bleak winter sleeping out of doors like animals, returns it as his conviction that at least 20% are Army Reserve men. 20%! That is to say, 1 man in every 5 with whom we shall have to deal has served Her Majesty the Queen under the colours. This is the resource to which these poor fellows come after they have given the prime of their lives to the service of their country. Although this may be largely brought about by their own thriftless and evil conduct, it is a scandal and a disgrace which may well make the cheek of the patriot tingle. Still, I see in it a great resource. A man who has been in the Queen's army is a man who has learnt to obey. He is further a man who has been taught in the roughest of rough schools to be handy and smart, to make the best of the roughest fare, and not to consider himself a martyr if he is sent on a forlorn hope. I often say, if we could only get Christians to have 1/2 of the practical devotion and sense of duty that animates even the commonest Tommy Atkins, what a change would be brought about in the world. Look at poor Tommy, a country lad who gets himself into some scrape, runs away from home, finds himself sinking lower and lower, with no hope of employment, no friends to advise him, and no one to give him a helping hand. In sheer despair he takes the Queen's shilling and enters the ranks. He is handed over to an inexorable drill sergeant. He is compelled to room in barracks where privacy is unknown, to mix with men, many of them vicious, few of them companions whom he would of his own choice select. He gets his rations, and although he is told he will get a shilling a day, there are so many stoppages that he often does not finger a shilling a week. He is drilled and worked and ordered hither and thither as if he were a machine, all of which he takes cheerfully, without even considering that there is any hardship in his lot, plodding on in a dull, stolid kind of way for his Queen and his country, doing his best also, poor chap, to be proud of his red uniform, and to cultivate his self-respect, by reflecting that he is one of the defenders of his native land, one of the heroes upon whose courage and endurance depends the safety of the British realm. Some fine day, at the other end of the world, some prancing proconsul finds it necessary to smash one of the man-slaying machines that loom ominous on his borders, or some savage potentate makes an incursion into the territory of a British colony, or some fierce outburst of Mohammedan fanaticism raises up a Mahdi in mid-Africa. In a moment Tommy Atkins is marched off to the troopship and swept across the seas, heartsick and seasick, and miserable exceedingly, to fight the Queen's enemies in foreign parts. When he arrives there, he is bundled ashore, brigaded with other troops, marched to the front through the blistering glare of a tropical sun, over poisonous marshes in which his comrades sicken and die, until at last he is drawn up in square to receive the charge of tens of thousands of ferocious savages, far away from all who love him or care for him, footsore and travel-weary, having eaten perhaps but a piece of dry bread in the last 24 hours. He must stand up and kill or be killed. Often he falls beneath the thrust of an assegai, or the slashing broadsword of the charging enemy. Then, after the fight is over, his comrades turn up the sod where he lies, bundle his poor bones into the shallow pit, and leave him without even a cross to mark his solitary grave. Perhaps he is fortunate and escapes. Yet Tommy goes uncomplainingly through all these hardships and privations, does not think himself a martyr, takes no fine airs about what he has done and suffered, and shrinks uncomplainingly into our shelters and our factories, only asking, as a benediction from heaven, that someone will give him an honest job of work to do. That is the fate of Tommy Atkins. If in our churches and chapels as much as one single individual were to bear and dare, for the benefit of his kind and the salvation of men, what 100,000 Tommy Atkins bear uncomplainingly, taking it all as if it were in the day's work, for their rations and their shilling a day, with stoppages, think you we should not transform the whole face of the world? Yea, verily, we find but very little of such devotion. No, not in Israel. I look forward to making great use of these Army Reserve men. There are engineers amongst them. There are artillerymen and infantry. There are cavalrymen who know what a horse needs to keep him in good health, and men of the transport department, for whom I shall find work enough to do in the transference of the multitudinous waste of London from our town depots to the outlying farm. This, however, is a digression, by the way. After having got the farm into some kind of ship-shape, we should select from the city colonies all those who were likely to be successful as our first settlers. These would consist of men who had been working so many weeks or days in the labor factory, or had been under observation for a reasonable time at the shelters or in the slums, and who had given evidence of their willingness to work, their amenity to discipline, and their ambition to improve themselves. On arrival at the farm, they would be installed in a barracks, and at once told off to work. In winter time there would be draining and road-making and fencing and many other forms of industry which could go on when the days are short and the nights are long. In spring, summer-time, and autumn, some would be employed on the land, chiefly in spade husbandry, upon what is called the system of intensive agriculture, such as prevails in the suburbs of Paris, where the market gardeners literally create the soil, and which yields much greater results than when you merely scratch the surface with a plow. Our farm, I hope, would be as productive as a great market garden. There would be a superintendent of the colony, who would be a practical gardener, familiar with the best methods of small agriculture, and everything that science and experience shows to be needful for the profitable treatment of the land. Then there would be various other forms of industry continually in progress, so that employment could be furnished, adapted to the capacity and skill of every colonist. Where farm buildings are wanted, the colonists must erect them themselves. If they want glass houses, they must put them up. Everything on the estate must be the production of the colonists. Take, for instance, the building of cottages. After the first detachment has settled down into its quarters and brought the fields somewhat into cultivation, there will arise a demand for houses. These houses must be built and the bricks made by the colonists themselves. All the carpentering and the joinery will be done on the premises, and by this means a sustained demand for work will be created. Then there would be furniture, clothing, and a great many other wants, the supply of the whole of which would create labor which the colonists must perform. For a long time to come, the Salvation Army will be able to consume all the vegetables and crops which the colonies will produce. That is one advantage of being connected with so great and growing a concern. The right hand will help the left, and we shall be able to do many things which those who devote themselves exclusively to colonization would find it impossible to accomplish. We have seen the large quantities of provisions which are required to supply the food depots in their present dimensions, and with the coming extensions, the consumption will be enormously augmented. On this farm I propose to carry on every description of little agriculture. I have not yet referred to the female side of our operations, but have reserved them for another chapter. It is necessary, however, to bring them in here in order to explain that employment will be created for women as well as men. Fruit farming affords a great opening for female labor, and it will indeed be a change, as from Tophet to the Garden of Eden, when the poor lost girls on the streets of London exchange the pavements of Piccadilly for the strawberry beds of Essex or Kent. Not only will vegetables and fruits of every description be raised, but I think that a great deal might be done in the smaller adjuncts of the farm. It is quite certain that amongst the mass of people with whom we have to deal, there will be a residual remnant of persons to some extent mentally infirm or physically incapacitated from engaging in the harder toils. For these people it is necessary to find work, and I think there would be a good field for their benumbed energies in looking after rabbits, feeding poultry, minding bees, and, in short, doing all those little odd jobs about a place which must be attended to, but which will not repay the labor of able-bodied men. One advantage of the cosmopolitan nature of the army is that we have officers in almost every country in the world. When this scheme is well on the way, every Salvation officer in every one will have it imposed upon him as one of the duties of his calling to keep his eyes open for every useful notion and every conceivable contrivance for increasing the yield of the soil and utilizing the employment of waste labor. By this means, I hope that there will not be an idea in the world which will not be made available for our scheme. If an officer in Sweden can give us practical hints as to how they manage food kitchens for the people, or an officer in the south of France can explain how the peasants are able to rear eggs and poultry, not only for their own use, but so as to be able to export them by the million to England, if a sergeant in Belgium understands how it is that the rabbit farmers there can feed and fatten and supply our market with millions of rabbits, we shall have him over, tap his brains, and set him to work to benefit our people. By the establishment of this farm colony, we should create a great school of technical agricultural education. It would be a working men's agricultural university, training people for the life which they would have to lead in the new countries they will go forth to colonize and possess. Every man who goes to our farm colony does so, not to acquire his fortune, but to obtain a knowledge of an occupation and that mastery of his tools which will enable him to play his part in the battle of life. He will be provided with a cheap uniform, which we shall find no difficulty in rigging up from the old clothes of London, and it will go hardly with us, and we shall have worse luck than the ordinary market gardener, if we do not succeed in making sufficient profit to pay all the expenses of the concern, and leave something over for the maintenance of the hopelessly incompetent, and those who, to put it roughly, are not worth their keep. Every person in the farm colony will be taught the elementary lesson of obedience, and will be instructed in the needful arts of husbandry, or some other method of earning his bread. The agricultural section will learn the lesson of the seasons, and of the best kind of seeds and plants. Those belonging to this section will learn how to hedge and ditch, how to make the roads and build bridges, and generally to subdue the earth and make it yield to him the riches which it never withholds from the industrious and skillful workman. But the farm colony, any more than the city colony, although an abiding institution, will not provide permanently for those with whom we have to deal. It is a training school for emigrants, a place where those indispensably practical lessons are given, which will enable the colonists to know their way about and to feel themselves at home wherever there is land to till, stock to rear, and harvests to reap. We shall rely greatly for the peace and prosperity of the colony upon the sense of brotherhood which will be universal in it, from the highest to the lowest. While there will be no systematic wage-paying, there will be some sort of rewards and remuneration for honest industry, which will be stored up for his benefit, as afterwards explained. They will in the main work each for all, and therefore the needs of all will be supplied, and any overplus will go to make the bridge over which any poor fellow may escape from the horrible pit and the miry clay from which they themselves have been rescued. The dullness and deadness of country life, especially in the colonies, leads many men to prefer a life of hardship and privation in a city slum. But in our colony they would be near to each other, and would enjoy the advantages of country life and the association and companionship of life in town. End of section 18.